Hello, this is Mike Fauché. Today I want to talk about an inexpensive add-on card that when used with the right type of SSD will make a huge difference in your performance. Hello, and thanks for taking the opportunity to watch this video. Today I want to walk through an inexpensive way to add on speed and storage to your system. What you see here is a couple different cards which I'm going to walk through and show you how they work, and then at the end of the video we'll run some benchmark tests to see if they perform as advertised. We're only going to test one of the cards because they're effectively the same type of card, and I expect the performance to be exactly the same. Before we start putting things together, I want to briefly talk about the different types of SSDs. So I'm sure you've seen these type before, which is basically your standard 2.5 inch Samsung or any brand for that matter. Typically used as a hard drive replacement. They're reliable, fast, and they're a great upgrade to your system. However, what we're here to talk about today is really a couple other types of drives. You have another type of drive called an M.2, and here's a couple of examples of the M.2. If we look at this one here, we're looking at a 970 Pro, which has approximately 3.5 gigabytes per second transfer rate versus the 550 range that you're going to see from this drive. Although these look similar to this, there are two different types, and I want to talk briefly about those two different types. This is actually a standard SATA drive. So even though it's in this form factor and obviously can be mounted on motherboards that have this type of adapter, the performance basically between this and this is roughly the same. You don't really see any difference at all. The nVME, however, is completely different, and I want to draw your attention, and hopefully you can see this through the video, but there's a key here, and I'll try and zoom in on this here in just a second, and let's see if we can't put these together. So if you look closely at these notches here, you'll see that the Samsung Pro only has one notch on the right hand side, while the standard SATA drives actually has two notches. And if you look at the pictures, I'll try and supply some links so you can look at a little bit closer shots. But basically that's what distinguishes these two drives, is actually the notch. And this is critical because when you buy one of these M.2 drives, you want to make sure that as we use them in these cards, that you actually buy the nVME type, because that's the only one that's going to work with these adapters. And let's take one apart so you can kind of see what it looks like. Okay, so let's go ahead and pop open a couple of these boxes here so we can get an idea of what these look like. And I'm going to spare you the screwdriver and the screws, but basically these come kind of fully equipped, so you can put it together pretty easily yourself. And the card itself is really simple. So what you see here is basically just a single card that has the slot, and you'll notice here on this slot that it has the same notch that's on this Samsung Pro. And the process for putting this together is very simple, and I'm going to show you on this other card because I'm not going to put this one together, but in essence you're going to put a standoff next to the appropriate size, and these kind of just slip in at a slight angle here and then just push down and basically screw down. So that's what holds these in place. But again, we're going to use this card because this one actually comes with a heat sink. The one thing I want to mention about these particular types of drives is they get extremely hot. And when they get hot, they throttle, and therefore you lose some of the effectivity of the performance. What I typically do is put a heat sink on these. I buy these kits it comes with a heat sink and the clips, and it snaps together with some thermal compound, which you probably can't see very well on the video, but there's a thermal pad underneath the heat sink and the top of this SSD. And this is critical. So if you're going to mount an SSD like this on a card like this that's open, you're going to want to use a heat sink. Now I've deliberately removed the heat sink off of this this 970 so we can put together on this type of card, because I'm going to show you another kind of card here. So let's go ahead and set this one aside here for a moment. And let's go ahead and open this one up. And this one here is basically identical with a couple of notable exceptions. The first thing you're going to notice when you take this apart is it's a lot better built. So we're going to go ahead and take this apart, set this aside for a moment. And as you can see here, this card, let me just go ahead and zoom in a little bit. So as you can see, there's some visual differences with these cards. Number one, this card actually is designed to fit in any size slot. So you can go with a by 4, a by 8, or a by 16 slot. Now, notice this card here only has the by 4 slot. Now, even though this is a times 16 slot, it will not run at times 16. If you look closely, and you're probably going to not be able to see it very well, but there are traces that go to these boards that make the connection between the M.2 connector and the circuitry that plugs into your motherboard. There's only circuitry on the first part of this. The only reason that this is actually a multi-slot card is for mechanical strength only. So as I put this in a larger slot, it's going to hold a little bit tighter. You'll notice this card has no mounting at all, whereas this card actually mounts into your standard expansion slot on your computer. So we're going to use this one. The other main difference is obviously this one comes with a nice big heat sink, and that's something that we're going to want to use. So let's go ahead and put this thing together, and then we can run some tests on it. So the first thing we're going to do is take out these pads, because this comes with actually a whole bunch of pads here. They give you some extras depending on how your particular board is configured. So let's go ahead and now take this apart. This has basically 4 screws in the back. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's go ahead and take that apart. Okay, so basically we've got this board apart, and as you can see, let me turn it around here. There isn't much on this thing but basically traces, because your connection, or the interface type between what plugs into your board and this particular type of drive is exactly the same. These are designed to run on a ×4 PCI Express. So all you're really doing is making connections to your motherboard. So let's go ahead and put this thing together. So we're going to use this little standoff here. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is take the larger pad. As you can see here, this plastic peels off, and we're going to place this larger pad right on this SSD here. So we're going to put it as far back as we can so it doesn't interfere with the connector at all. Okay, and that's pretty good. And don't forget to take the top layer off, because there's also a piece of clear plastic on top of the thermal pad. So what you should end up with is very soft thermal pad on the top of the SSD. So the next thing we're going to do with that is basically slide it into this board. So we're going to take the SSD, which you can notice the slots match up nicely. There we go. And that fits in like this. And then we're going to head and put that screw back in here. like that. So what you have here is that little tiny round post that's got the kind of a groove in it that holds the SSD down, while this screw actually just holds that post down. So now, as you can see, this drive is mounted nice and flush with an air gap underneath. So from that point on, what we're going to do here is actually put the heatsink back on, and we're going to do that by lining up this front groove here on this heatsink. As you can see, there's a cutaway there, and we're going to go ahead and put that in here. That actually faces the front, and then the drive should fit nicely into this heatsink, which it does. It's nice and flat. From there, we're going to put this back plate on, and that back plate has 3 holes in it to match up one of the 3 screws here. So we're going to line that up with the screw and basically slide this right in. It should just fit right in like that. So at that point, we're going to put the 4 screws back in that we took out originally. I wouldn't tighten these all the way until I get all 4 in there, just to keep it from popping up on the side. So if all went well, what we should see here is a nice even gap all the way. This should be nice and flat. And let's make sure these are all tight so that we don't have anything coming loose. And there we have it. So now you can see I've got my SSD drive mounted with a nice heatsink on top. And this only piece I have is this to clip into either a ×4, ×8, or ×16 slot. So I'm going to show you how that's mounted. It's pretty straightforward. And then we're going to run some tests on it and see how it works. Okay, as you can see from the video, it's a little bit difficult, but you can see that the inside of my test board there, my test system, has an empty PCI Express slot, and that's the one we're going to use for testing. So I'm going to go ahead and insert that. Okay, that should do it right there. So as you can see, the unit's been inserted into a ×16 slot, and we're going to go ahead and use that for testing. And again, remember, these units only run at ×4, even though it's plugged into a ×16 slot. It just holds the board a little tighter. Let's see how this thing runs. Okay, let's get into some testing. As you can see on the display, I actually have 3 Samsung drives in the system. The first one being the 850, which is the 2.5-inch drive that we saw earlier in the video. And then I also have the 960, which is actually mounted directly to the motherboard. And lastly, we have the 970 Pro, which is the one that we just put into the add-in card. So we're going to run a benchmark called ATTO on each one of those so you can see the difference, and ultimately so you can see that the plug-in card is every bit as fast as a board mounted directly to, or SSD mounted directly to the board. And that's really the big thrust here, is to compare that putting an SSD, an nVMe SSD, into an add-in board does not impact performance whatsoever, and that's what we're going to demonstrate here today. So let's start with the testing. Okay, we're going to start with the D drive, which is actually the, as I mentioned, the 850. So I'm going to go ahead and run this test. Okay, so there you have the first test, and again, this was the 850 standard 2.5-inch SSD that we'll use as our baseline comparison when we're comparing the other two. As you can also see that it's tapping out about 550, which is kind of what we estimated in the very beginning. So let's go on to the next one. Okay, so the next one we're going to do is the 960 Pro, which is actually mounted to the motherboard directly. So let's compare that. And this is actually an nVMe drive as well, so we'll get to compare the difference between nVMe and a standard SSD in this particular test, and then ultimately, as I mentioned, we'll test the plug-in card against this particular drive. So let's go ahead and start. Okay, so there you have the next results. As you can see, we're up into the 3.1 gigabytes per second in read speed, which is significantly faster than a standard SSD. So here we're comparing the difference between an NVMe drive and a standard SSD. So now the next part, let's compare the add-in card to this drive. Bear in mind there's slight differences. The 970 is marginally faster than the 960. But at least we'll get to see if plugging that in to a simple, under $20 extension card will actually make a difference. Okay, let's go on to the last test now. We're going to now test the Samsung 970 on the extender card. What I'd like to do is also show you what happens to the temperature. Now bear in mind this is the card that has the heatsink, so it should stay reasonably cool. Without a card, you can expect these NVMe drives to approach 100 degrees C and then start throttling. Now they're designed to run at that temperature because that's why they've enabled throttling. However, when you throttle, you do give up some performance. So keeping it cool is kind of important in my opinion. Again, these are designed to run and can be run without any kind of heat sinking. But when you put it on a card that actually has heat sink, you'll see it stays considerably cooler than if this card was running exposed, which I typically don't do because I don't like throttling. If you're spending an extra 20% to get an NVMe drive, then you're going to make sure that you get the maximum performance out of it. So let's go ahead and run that last drive on the adapter card and let's see what we get. Okay, there you have it. You can see that putting an NVMe drive in an extender card has very little to no impact in performance of the drive. And as you can see, there's no temperature problems either due to that nice heatsink that they bundle on there. So you've got kind of a win-win situation. It's a great way to upgrade your system. Now there's a couple of caveats I want to mention. Obviously, any PCI Express that is a ×4 or 8 or 16 will work with these add-in cards. The one thing I did want to mention is that if you choose to try and make this a bootable drive, that is system dependent. That means you'll have to make sure you have the most current BIOS, and you have to do a little bit of research on your motherboard. They will basically always work as a secondary drive, like if you wanted to use it for games, scratch drive, whatever it is that you're using it for, data, it'll be fine. However, if you're trying to use it as a boot drive, which many people do, you'll need to do a little bit of homework in terms of checking out to make sure that your motherboard can boot from a PCI Express card. And it has really nothing to do with the type of card you plug in there. It only has to do with, can I boot from the card or can't I? So check your motherboard, do a little homework, maybe check forums, support sites, anything you might find on your motherboard if you decide to use it as a boot drive. Before you go through all this trouble, make sure it's going to work. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe and set the notifications so you'll be notified on future videos. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. We'll see you on the next one.